use. I'm sorry. Fair use. Fair use. I wanted to basically talk to you guys about what we about to watch right now, which you probably can't really see that well because of how my TV is showing right now. But then it's like if I were to show it to you where you can really see it, they probably gonna put some kind of copyright bullshit on me doing it. But that's why I'm going fair use. So some of this could go across to you so you can see it for yourself too. The shit that these policemen are doing and getting away with this shit is us being stupid fucking people in this shit. Because it's time for us as the people to start cleaning fucking house. And what I mean by it's time for us as the people to start cleaning house, we are not holding our state representatives accountable for their bullshit. And it's time to hold the people that's supposed to be in authority accountable for them being in authority and not being shit. And what I mean by not being shit, all right, what y'all about to hear and maybe see a little part of it is dealing with a man being beat the fuck up and after being beat up, charged after being beat up just so the man wouldn't have no charges to file towards the fucking rabbit dog ass fucking police. I just call it how it is, I is. And this dude on the Advice show, I'm like this, dog. I'm gonna put your name up on here because this is your shit. I'm just talking with your shit, with you with some true shit about some real shit. And that's what these policemen are being out of control with. And that's beating the fuck out of us. But if we lay up there and beat our fucking kids, to chastise our fucking kids, we can be put in fucking jail for it. You can't tell me that don't make us stupid. When you sit there and you look at that shit for yourself, the police could beat us up and kill us and get the fuck away with it. But if you beat your kid just to chastise your kid for some stupid shit that your kid did, you can go to jail for it. We are some stupid ass motherfucking sheep people. So like I said, fair use, motherfuckers. Fair motherfucking use. So here we go. Check it out. I just want to know why. Why are we allowing this bullshit to happen?
Beaten by police because they claim he didn't comply with their orders. Well, he didn't comply because the man was deaf. He wasn't really cook.
Neighbors say they're outraged after a man was allegedly beaten by Oklahoma Highway Patrol troopers. Friends say that man is deaf. Could that have played into the incident?
I
Pictures
would
posted
love to see that
online
picture
show
of that dude.
64-year-old Pearl Pearson
Oh, that dude
life.
fucked
But do the pictures tell the whole story? The
up.
Tonight 274
And then,
is working
and
on
then
the
you
story,
got,
and the police affidavit claims the man was.
and then you got your rogue ass motherfucking news bullshit. They want to lay up there and say that the picture. Fuck, I wouldn't give a fuck if the man left a motherfucking hit and motherfucking run. I don't give a fuck if you gonna jump on this man and beat this man and fuck up. You gotta already know what the fuck he done. This was a deaf fucking man. This is some bullshit. And then we're gonna get into what the fuck happened to me with Walmart again and shit. Because the way I'm gonna deal with this here, I'm not gonna need no fucking liar lawyer to be a liar as my lawyer when I already know that they lie to the judge because they all a bunch of liars. I'm gonna defend my motherfucking self because the first thing about what happened to me, it didn't happen to my fucking liar lawyer. It happened to me. So therefore, they are not. I am not their fucking property for them to live and have to have me live there and subject myself to have somebody represent me when I can represent myself in a divine creator within me that gave me life, that gave me free will, that gave me the motherfucking choices to deal with y'all bullshit. It is what it is, and I already know this.
At the scene of a crash.
That's right, Linda. An alleged hit and run. No
Alleged.
details of
See,
the altercation.
once again, alleged is their way of covering their ass for sitting up there and lying about making this man look like a corporate in the fucking bullshit that happened to this man. Because just because this man couldn't hear what the fuck they were saying, so he didn't do what the fuck they wanted him to do, they beat the fucking man up. Listen to the bullshit.
Were given, but one hearing impaired group says Pearson had a sign in his door saying driver is deaf, and they claim he was struck in the face before he had a chance to show his driver's license. These are photos of 64-year-old Pearl Pearson, a man who allegedly suffered these injuries to his face at the hands of 2 OHP troopers during a traffic stop in Oklahoma City, January 3rd. An affidavit says Pearson fled the scene of a minor crash in South Oklahoma City and was eventually pulled over here at the Eastern Avenue exit of eastbound I-40. The affidavit says Pearson resisted Trooper Foster and Trooper Hayes and refused to comply with repeated orders to display his hands. What is not listed in the affidavit is that Pearson is deaf. It goes on to say a physical altercation ensued for 7 minutes.
Because that man know what the fuck was going on.
After being taken to a hospital,
he thought he was being killed. He thought come on, who gonna just let somebody beat them the fuck up? Come on, people.
Source for hearing loss and access. Responses included, I thought law enforcement officers were educated on deaf culture, and God will punish them for what they did to Pearl.
He can't hear. He's hearing impaired. There's no... You can't yell at him from behind his car and get a response.
Seisha Law is Pearson's neighbor. She says he's a kind and generous man, a happy soul. The altercation, she believes, is a misunderstanding by troopers that went too far.
I know that they do dangerous jobs and they put their lives on the line, but that is over the top.
Charges still have not been filed against Pearson. The OHP said our request for an interview has been forwarded to the proper division for consideration.
If the man would have did what they said that he did, he would have charged. I'll stop again.
Thursday evening.
Think about it. If the man would have did what they said that he had did, they'd have charged him. Because a hit and run is a what? It's a motherfucking charge. So for them to get this man resisting fucking arrest is because they beat this fucking man up and they knew that this man was gonna sue they bitch ass for that bullshit they didn't did to this motherfucking man. It is what it is, people. We got to wake up from the fucking trance that these sons of bitches done put us in, to having us thinking that we supposed to be under the jurisdiction of their fucking ruling when they are ruling fucking wrong with us. The only fucking people that's benefiting in the motherfucking court of motherfucking law is a motherfucker that already got some motherfucking money. Some bullshit, people. Fair use. Fair use. Fair use. Fair use. Fair use. I'm like I said, the songs got meaning for them to be in the background of me talking, because all of everything is a part of all of us being here created. I'm just saying. See, I get to the point where it hurts my heart to know that we have been taught to be stupid, to believe in some shit that don't make sense, to the point where you can't make nothing out of it. So how can you ever believe in some shit that don't make no sense? When the truth is, you are all the sense that anything outside of you could ever be. The divine creator is in you. Oh man, it's wild, because they got people actually thinking some God in the sky and some Jesus coming back to save them. And these crackers done already admitted to they made that shit up to control fucking people. But some people just don't want to let go of the fucking lie. What the fuck? You was taught to believe in Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy. Alright, now you done realize that that's a lie. Now you gotta go and sit back and think, why? Why was that perpetrated in the first place? If it was a lie. Everything got a cause and effects and a reason why. And that's just it. You're not asking the right questions. You're only asking the question that you was told to ask. But you gotta ask the question as the Creator is telling you to ask. Because it's in you to choose to. Because only one way is the divine creator within you, and that's the love to never hate. But we're human. It is what it is. But we're not animals. No disrespect to the animals. All disrespect to you humans that's eating animals like you're an animal. I'm just saying, you're human.
For more information on that and on the alleged abuse against him, log on to KFOR.com/links.
Alleged. Do you see what our news do? Do you see what our news do now? Our news ain't much the news no more for us. Our news is just the news for the rich and the police and the government bullshit.
If you talking to this man, obviously it's like he's not understanding. You can't think in your mind and say, wait a minute, what's wrong with this guy? I mean, is something wrong?
That's cold-blooded.
I mean, anybody with half a brain will try to look at a situation. You're supposed to be a peace officer, yet a peace officer is the most violent ones walking around the street. Why is that? Nobody question that behavior? You sit up here beating down
old man.
People.
Old deaf man.
Who is that? I remember that brother.
And I'm saying old deaf man. I'm thinking about fuck that. They slammed me on the motherfucking ground. And I'm a man in a wheelchair. Shit, I'm 48. I ain't that motherfucker spring chicken.
I knew the man was like that. These police do not care. If somebody's mentally handicapped, how is somebody going to comply with your orders and yet they can't hear you? I mean, you can hear, they can't.
Wow.
And then the man had a stick on his car saying he was deaf. You didn't look at the car when you approached it and say, let me assess the car too. I mean, what is going on? We have some of the most incompetent men and women being peace officers today, like more than ever. We hear these stories all the time. And like I said, we need to keep exposing these stories. Let the general public know. And once again, they won't show the pictures of the police. Why? They are public servants. If you a judge, if you a police officer, something like that, you should be shown to the public.
You're right.
Anything you do, good or bad.
Right.
How I feel about it.
Because we are being showed.
They don't want you to know who they are.
We are being showed.
They want to protect their family.
She fuck protecting they shit. You throw our shit out there, our dirty laundry out there when our laundry dirty. How you gonna hide they shit? That means if you hide they shit, they can do they shit again.
Crushing the testicles of a young man, then you're sitting up here beating on deaf people. I mean, what's the limit to this stuff? And let me say something else. When it comes to President Obama, you know why a lot of black people are upset at President Obama? Because he refused to address this kind of stuff.
Free use, nigga. Free use.
Black people feel less about, or anybody feel less about. But he won't address police brutality. He won't address that. And that can be easily solved by just making examples out of police officers.
Make an example out of them son bitches.
Put fear in their heart.
Put them bitches in jail.
No, they don't do that. They have to aggressively work.
Put the shoe on the other motherfucking foot and see if it fits.
Who have their rights by the Constitution, yet they're treated like they don't have rights. It's sad. I mean, these police officers ain't paid crap. But the only thing they get out of being a police officer is power trip.
Yep, power trip.
Because if they're really trying to serve their community and try to protect the community.
Your advice show, dog, I like those circles, boy. That just remind me of the bubbles, baby. That's all the circles of life for us to be here straight. Think about it.
Hey, that's one thing.
Those bubbles that you see are the water that you are. That flows, and no one can stop it. Now they got a dude that got his testicles snatched up. I don't hear about that one there, but then y'all checking out these fucked up ass movies that's coming out. I mean, it's like everything is so gruesome. The one with the dude with testicles, man. That's fucked up. I know that wasn't Barkley just now, man. Are you sure that was Barkley? That was. was all
Welcome to the
great,
Advice
man.
Show Media.
I'm not trying to get paid for this shit. I'm just doing fair use, and I'm not just doing fair use of this shit. I'm sharing his shit so you
Welcome
can
to
know
the
about
Advice
this shit.
Show Media with
I
a
can
common
do that.
sense approach. So there's a story came out of a man that was leaving his girlfriend's house. He was pulled over by
It's a
police,
while back too.
and they beat him down and charged him with all kind of charges. The funny thing is, this man didn't do anything they charged him with.
None of the
We're gonna
shit.
roll the clip.
That dash cam video helped provide a Bloomfield, New Jersey man's innocence. It's a story we first broke at 7 Online.
This 30-year-old
This
faced
is
a
what I was
number
saying.
of
You
charges,
think about
including
it.
eluding
Think
police
about
and
all the
assault.
different people that this shit can happen
Sarah
to.
Lawrence obtained the dash cam tapes, and she spoke exclusively with him. Sarah?
Well, Diana and Sade, quite a turnabout. All of the criminal charges against Marcus Jeter have been dismissed. 2 Bloomfield cops have now been
So they
indicted.
can't give me no copyrights on nothing that y'all can't even see. Y'all just basically listening to it and listening to me.
Cops
And
may
listen
have
to
tried
real
to
music
hide.
on the sideline. I'm just saying.
This is the Bloomfield Police Department's dash cam video that prosecutors say they never saw when they pursued criminal charges against 30-year-old Marcus Jeter.
They never saw.
Notice his hands in the air.
None.
He was charged with eluding police,
So
resisting
just
arrest,
think
and
they
assault.
didn't have the tape.
Who throws
Just think they had a
punches.
tape. Now, Walmart got a fucking tape. And Walmart won't give them the motherfucking tape of what happened to me. Tell me that ain't some bullshit.
The incident began when cops were called to the Bloomfield home Jeter shares with his girlfriend.
I'm
No
trying to get
charges were filed, and Jeter says he left after
irritated when I
briefly
get to
talking
that
to
part.
officers.
Oh,
They
what
say you
happened?
were eluding them.
When they were behind me with the lights on, I pulled right over. You know,
So you were trying to escape.
no, I wasn't trying to escape.
In a video from the first police car, prosecutors did see Jeter stops on the side of the Garden State Parkway. The cops pulled out guns. Why didn't you just get out of the car?
I was afraid.
No.
There was a cop on my left with a gun pointed at me, and there was one on my right side with a shotgun pointed. I'm afraid that I might get shot.
If you got out.
Mhm.
The tape not initially turned over is on the dash of a second police car that comes from the opposite direction, crosses the median into ongoing traffic, and then strikes Jeter's car. There is no mention of that in any police report. When Jeter
And
first
y'all
told
want to
his attorney
believe
that
what the
part of
police are
story,
saying?
It was incredible.
If you're
I
looking
didn't
at it,
believe
police are lying more than ever
so you
now.
finally believed him then.
Yes. The next thing I know, as he was coming around the car, the glass gets busted.
That's the reason why I wear video and audio all the time now.
Your hands are up.
My hands were up. As soon as they opened the door, one of the officers reached in and just punched me in my face. As he tried to take the seatbelt off, he elbowed me in my jaw. And I'm like, ah. And he was like, stop trying to take my gun. Stop resisting arrest. Stop trying to take my gun. And as he's saying that, I just knew, and I was
They
sitting there like my mind, like, okay,
initiated
this is
on
gonna go
killing
wrong.
people on the road to this new world order bullshit and rank. Okay? Reader just gave me that. And I told it out there.
And right before when they opened the door about to put me in, the officer hits me in the back of the head again.
As soon as prosecutors
Almost
saw
like-
this
it's almost
video,
like the
they
messages
dismissed
that you
all of
get
the
in when you
charges
get into
against
a game.
Jeter. Interesting to note, an investigation by Bloomfield PD's Scandal Plate Internal Affairs Division had found no wrongdoing by police officers.
The
Wow.
blame is with the Bloomfield Police Department not providing that tape. If we hadn't had the tapes in this particular case, innocent man would be in jail today.
In jail.
I'm sure that if this happened to me, it could happen to
It doesn't
a
happen.
bunch of other people.
It ain't could happen. It didn't
Scary,
happen.
right?
It's a scary situation.
And we were there exclusively today in Essex County Court in Newark, where Bloomfield police officers Sean Porter, there on the left, and Orlando Trinidad, who you will see here on the right, were arraigned on charges including conspiracy, official misconduct, and falsifying reports. Trinidad is also charged with aggravated assault. They pleaded not guilty. By the way, you can watch much more of my extended interview with Marcus Jeter on our website, 7 Online.
The first thing I got an issue with this video, let's talk about his defense attorney. When you hire a defense attorney, they supposed to fight for you.
Nah.
How did you say you didn't
Nah.
believe his story?
Nah.
So the only time you gonna believe it when
Nah.
the second video came
Like I
out?
said again,
I mean,
I
like,
don't need no
dude,
fucking
you
liar
screwing
lawyer
yourself.
so
What
to
you
be
want
my
the cops to
defense
do? You trying to
attorney.
screw it.
If I can't
Let's get
afford
to
no
the cops.
motherfucking attorney,
You see
I
how
don't
dirty
need one that's gonna
police
sell
are?
me the fuck
And
out
once
because I
again,
can't afford one.
stop calling the
Fuck
police
you
to the house
and your
for
attorney.
between y'all. Could you see
I can defend my motherfucking self. It happened to me any motherfucking way.
Get killed over for nothing.
Y'all gotta deal with me now.
Because you don't know what kind of police you call into your house. They got some racist police that's in the police forces of America that don't like minorities, don't like black men. So they try to do everything they can to put us in prison. Now you saw this man pulled over when he was asked to by the police, obviously with the lights on. They sat up there, beat that brother down. Sat up there, kept saying, "Stop resistance, I'm trying to take my gun." You know why he said that? Because so he can get away with it. Because as long as he say certain things, they're going to say, "Oh, well, he was doing it because the cop's saying that he did it." They beat this brother down, hitting him in the back of the head, everything. I mean, come on. You got a bunch of guns drawn on you. I'll be honest with you. A black man seeing a bunch of white police officers drawing guns on him, hell yeah, you scared. I'm going to keep it real. Man, yeah, a black man scared to see a bunch of white police officers drawing guns because you know what? You don't end too well when that happens. I'm sorry, it's true. Now some people say, well, they do it to everybody. I'm sorry, when it comes to us as black men, we get shot a whole lot more. We get terrorized a whole lot more by police. Sorry, we do. So I understand why he was scared. Any brother be scared to see that scenario. Like, why you need that many guns on one dude that's sitting there with his hands up? You looking to do something to him. But I'm glad these cops is exposed. I'm glad this man was exonerated. But like he said, it happened to him. It could happen to a bunch of other people as well. I mean, when this stuff gonna stop, man? When the Attorney General of the United States or even the President will get involved with this stuff? You want to do something happy for me, President Obama, make me happy? Why don't you sit here and stop these police from brutalizing everybody? Stop killing folks. That would make me happy. You sit up there trying to champion all this stuff, fighting for all this stuff that don't even really matter to everybody. I'm sorry, you can get mad when I'm about to say. I don't, him always fighting stuff and fighting people about gay rights and gay marriage. That don't benefit me. You know what benefits me and everybody else? Stop these police from beating us down. Stop these police from shooting us down. That's what we can stop. That could benefit everybody. Gay, straight, whatever. That's what you need to do. You champion and stuff that don't benefit everybody for political points. I can't stand politicians.
Yeah, because
bullshit. I think this. Why don't you focus on stuff that benefit everybody, not just one group? Because we all got issues in this nation. And we cannot feel terrorized by the police in this nation. The eyes of the world are watching this country, President Obama, and yet you do nothing. I'm sorry, you just don't. When it comes to stuff that affects everybody, not just one group, everybody. These police are out of control. The NSA is out of control. We know this stuff every single day. You got to start addressing this, because if you don't, it's like you go along with it. It's sickening. It's sad. Trying to take our gun rights away every single day. Yes, I support gun rights 100%. You know why I support gun rights 100%? Because the moment you take them away, guess what's going to happen? It's going to be like New York. You see how New York is beating people down every day because they ain't afraid nothing's going to happen to them. I support gun rights because, the moment black folks can't have their guns, it's going to get turned up on them again. Get that. Them brothers need to arm up like they did in Rosewood and everything else. I support gun rights 100%. Everybody have a right to defend themselves if they need to, or defend their household. So you know what these crooked police gonna do. Hit me up in the comments.
Yeah, I'm not gonna tell. I'm wrong with another things about this dude. I'm not gonna tell. What if this dude can't have them with children?
So we have a story of a young teenage boy that was approached by police and he was searched. No big deal. But what happened to this young brother brings a definite new meaning to the term that you hear sometimes called ball busting. Let's go ahead and roll the clip.
Live in Spring Garden with more on this story. Chris.
On the 16-year-old charter school student says he was roughed up by Philadelphia police so bad during a recent arrest it sent him to the hospital with possible injuries that could last a lifetime. We do want to warn you, some of the details of this story are graphic.
And I'm just grateful that they just didn't kill him.
16-year-old Darren Manning is still having trouble walking a week later. He suffered serious injuries to his genitals. He claims came at the hands of a Philadelphia police officer during a recent arrest.
I think that was wrong. That was going overboard.
Manning Manning, a sophomore at Mathematics, Civics, and Sciences Charter School, just got off the subway with about a dozen teammates in uniform on their way to play a high school basketball game. He says the group was confronted by police at Broad and Girard. Exactly why the students were stopped and questioned remains unclear. But Manning says he was put in handcuffs, then says during a pat-down, a female police officer squeezed his genitals so hard it ruptured his testicle.
She patted me down again, and then I felt her reach, and she grabbed my butt. And then she grabbed and squeezed again and pulled down. And that's when I heard something pop, like I felt it pop.
Hospital records show Manning spent the following night of his arrest at Children's Hospital, where he underwent emergency surgery. His mother says her son may have permanent injuries, preventing him from fathering children.
The doctor told me you need to press charges, and they just alarmed me.
Manning is now facing charges of aggravated assault and resisting arrest.
He don't deserve no felony. He's not a bad child. He's not in the streets. And I believe he was sexually assaulted.
The founder of the school says she was with Manning 10 minutes before the incident. She says this straight-A model student hasn't had a single discipline problem in his 3-year history at the school.
They shouldn't be able to do that to any child. But this is a 16-year-old. And then the force that was used in his private area, it sort of is concerning to me.
Now, police in the 22nd District tell us they are looking into this, and a possible internal affairs investigation may be launched in the coming days. But police also tell me that at the 8 hours that boy was in...
Do y'all understand what internal affair really means? It means that they're going to investigate the shit internally, so therefore it ain't gonna benefit them to get rid of the person that's already internally there. So that investigation ain't gonna go no motherfucking well. That's just some motherfucking word bullshit. See, until we, the people, come together and rewrite some bullshit that they didn't already wrote, that's bullshit. Because they done wrote up a whole lot of bullshit against us, the people. Especially when you look at marijuana is illegal. But cigarettes is okay, and they taxing that shit every day. But on the back of the pack it says second-hand smoke kills. Now what the fuck is wrong with us? These motherfuckers that own the banks, that own big pharmaceutical companies, Big Pharma and all this other bullshit, the corporations and shit, they know that the motherfucking marijuana has medical benefits. But it's gonna knock they motherfucking pockets crooked, as they are crooked. That's the reason why they got us fucked up with marijuana is a gateway drug. So it's put on the chart as a #1. Man, motherfucker go inside this goddamn store and buy some Tylenols and die from that shit. But a damn person never died from some fucking marijuana. How the fuck could we be so fucking stupid? I'm just saying, people.
In custody, he never complained, never reported any injuries.
Free use, fair use is all our use, baby. I ain't trying to pay off it. I just want people to know the truth for themselves.
Now, as you see in that piece, that wasn't no troublemaker. There wasn't no thug that was acting up. This boy is a straight-A student, don't give trouble in school. You even see on the interview, he dressed up in a suit. And yet this female cop literally busted his balls. Literally. We heard people just use that terminology, but she did that. I mean, could you imagine? I mean, somebody squeezing your testicles so hard that you hear a pop noise? I mean, that is not only a sexual assault, that's an assault as well. I mean, come on. I mean, there's no reason for her to do that. You check somebody for a weapon, that's it. You don't have to squeeze their testicles. No, that chick had some sort of sick fetish, and she wanted to do that jump to that boy. She knew what she was doing, and yet these police trying to cover for that woman. Sitting up there, he didn't complain. He wasn't in pain. Maybe he was like, dog, I better not say nothing. They can kill me.
Fair use.
Look what y'all did to him.
Fair
use. The dog on the street. You have him at the police station. He thinking y'all may kill him. I mean, this is wrong, man. These police do whatever they want to do, and they don't want nobody to say nothing. You act like you can just run around here and violate people's constitutional rights. They do this all over the country. It's not just this one brother. And when you need to speak up when you see these stories or put these stories out there exposing these police. Why these police get mad when you start pulling out your cell phone and start recording them? They get mad. What are you recording me for? Why not? You a public servant? What's the problem? Can the public see how great of a job you're doing in protecting the community? No, they don't want to be recorded. A lot of times they're doing stuff they don't have no business. Not all police, of course. But some of them, they're just no earthly good. That woman should be charged with a crime. And then to add insult to injury, you're talking about charging him. He's the victim. He didn't do nothing wrong. Resisting arrest, if you squeezing on my testicles, you don't think I was like moving or doing something? What you talking about? The boy's in handcuffs. How you resisting and you in handcuffs? That's stupid. But yeah, that's what the police can do. They can trump up charges on you and do whatever they want to do. And they always talk about, oh, well, you know, these thugs and black teens are being thugs. This boy is a straight A student. It doesn't matter if you're a thug in America. It doesn't matter. When them racist police want to get at you, they going to do it. And I notice every time, they don't mess with them thugs like that. You notice that? They don't go mess with a Crip or Blood or any other gang member. They don't fool with them. They always target
right now, a police
who is,
lying on somebody going to
not causing trouble, straight A student, somebody who is not threatening.
I guarantee you, after I get finished with Walmart and start my own foundation, where I'm going to do that shit for free. And by me not being able to read and write, to be learning how to read and write, and be able to know their laws, rules, and regulations, to be able to teach it to people so they can be able to defend themselves, put all the lying bitches in jail. I'm just trying to tell you.
Why is that? Why? Now, call me crazy. Last time I said this, I was spot on, so let's see how we get wrong this time.
Time to wake up people.
This particular lady was not put on the news because
feel the feeling of the love of the Creator. That love was all unconditional for us to be here, and for the Creator to up us to that point, to making us the greatest creation to be in, all together at the same time. We all divine, created by one divine Creator that gave each and every one of us life, free will, and a choice to will towards the Creator's willing and want, wait, love, to never hate. You stop the love of the Creator when you stop to hate.
I am not covering you up. I don't care what race you are. If I get suspicious, I'm
because love, unconditional feeling,
if you got the nerve,
it's eternal, baby.
Like that, then deal with the backlash. Deal with the people knowing who
when you
you
love
are.
them from your heart, you know you straight.
Stop trying to hide. You didn't hide and wasn't saying
that's why you're being
deal with the
judged by you right now, by what you do.
About this is horrible. Y'all
we live in a circle of life. What you do right now will come back to you around in the circle of this life. I'm just saying.
Man, that's the way y'all acting up there.
The truth is the truth.
Y'all, man, can't stand these stories like this. And then,
it's like when I sit there and I watch everything
my thing is
that people say on here, I sit there and I say to myself, we have real dirty people in our government.
All the objectives we seek, first and foremost, is the establishment of lasting world peace. But let our friends and those who may wish us ill take note. The United States has an obligation to its citizens and to the people of the world never to let those who would destroy freedom dictate the future course of life on this planet.
it's a $1,000 question. It's a $10 billion question.
America and most countries in the world are run by a very small percentage of the population.
Not even the President of the United States. It's the money man.
Obviously, the people in government aren't always the ones getting rich, so then you have to ask who are the ones behind it that are really getting rich, that are enjoying the benefits of this rip-off.
Or that's somehow you can see that.
What happens if you slice through the back of that system, set aside the system, you know, how you approach the power of the United States of America, how you lobby for a bill, how anyone can become president, how anyone can appeal to the people and ask for them to be voted into office. What happens if you go behind the scenes and just open the panel door and see how the system of power is really wired?
The interests of the American public have no bearing in the direction of the country, in the policy decisions. It doesn't matter which party we're talking about either. Republicans, Democrats, it's all the same thing. There's no voice for the people.
I think we're being controlled by a relatively small group of extremely powerful individuals that are pretty much pulling the strings behind both major parties, as well as the economic and financial institutions.
We're supposed to have the people being represented by the Congress, and this is a check and balance system. But instead, you have all branches of government owned by major corporations.
The folks who run America are the people who operate behind the scenes to make sure that the person who is in the seat of president and Congress and the people who we elect are the people that will do the bidding.
I think what you see is what it is. Who runs America are the banks and the multinationals. It's as simple as that, as I see it. They're the ones that have made all the decisions that have put us in the place that we're in now.
In 1937, Ferdinand Lundberg, who'd been a writer with Wall Street Journal and other financial publications, wrote a book called America's 60 Families. And in that book, documented that the country was being run by an oligarchy. The wealthiest families were the Mellons, the DuPonts, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Goldbergs. And it showed that they were running the country as an invisible government behind the democracy that we see upon the surface.
In fact, a study by Princeton University has come out saying that the United States is more of an oligarchy than it is a republic or democracy. Why? Because the public has no say in the policies and in the system that's been set up by politicians.
Go back to 2008, financial crisis is going. Henry Paulson, U.S. Treasury Secretary. Where did he come from? All the senators. Gets in front of the American people and tells us that he's going to save us little people from the problems we have in the real estate. In order to do that, you have to bail out the too big to fail. Too big to fail. 4 words. Shows you who's running the country. Capitalism, there's no such thing as freedom. It's fascism. It's multinational takeover. We bailed out the banks.
It's the unseen people that I'm more concerned about, really, because there's got to be someone, somewhere, that creates the agenda that all these people must follow.
Yeah, how y'all following that bullshit? That's the stupid shit that I'm just, it's like, wow. What part you don't understand, overstand, and understand? After they get finished using you, they gonna kill you because they don't want you to tell the secret.
Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan were growing in economic and political power. Americans were increasingly alarmed.
They killed all them people in September 11th. They killed all the people in the Holocaust. They killed all of us in slavery. They killed so many people, man. They dropped the bomb in Hiroshima.
The Rockefeller Morgan decided to distract Americans with a new enemy, Spain. The choice was not coincidental. Spain ruled Cuba, which by the 19th century had become the world's richest colony and largest sugar producer. National City Bank coveted Cuba's white gold as a complement to Standard Oil's black gold. The Yellow Press, led by William Randolph Hearst, New York Journal, began inundating Americans with fabricated tales of Spanish oppression. Spaniards feeding Cubans to sharks, roasting Cuban priests, slaughtering hospital patients where no hospital even existed. The decision to send the Maine to Havana was made at a secret White House meeting of which no minutes were kept. The Spanish government was not expecting the Maine when it sailed into Havana Harbor. Captain Charles Sigsbee, captain of the Maine, said,
"It became known to me afterward that the Maine had not been expected, even by the United States Consul General."
By what oversight was no one in Havana notified of the battleship's arrival? However, no shooting erupted. The Spanish permitted the Maine to dock. For 3 weeks, the Maine sat in Havana Harbor. In the meantime, the Yellow Press drove anti-Spanish feelings to fever pitch. William Randolph Hearst paid bribes to have the correspondence of the Spanish ambassador spied upon. One letter, critical of McKinley, was stolen and reprinted in the Hearst Journal under the headline, "The Worst Insult to the United States in its History." 2 days later, a horrific explosion tore apart the Maine.
We done basically false flagged every war we done been in.
A U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry attributed the explosion to an external device, but was unable to assign any blame. The Yellow Press had no reservations. The bombing, they claimed, was the work of the Spanish government. Americans were goaded into war with the battle cry, "Remember the Maine." Here, Spain is depicted as a semi-human brute, its bloodied hand on the grave of the Maine, and its foot trampling an American flag. The war was immortalized in American public memory by one-sided naval victories. Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. And the charge up San Juan Hill. But did Spain really sink the Maine? All Spanish documents reveal that Spain wished to avoid war with America at all costs. Her mostly wooden navy could not hope to compete with the modern U.S. Navy, which consisted increasingly of steel ships. Admiral Cervera, who commanded Spain's Atlantic Squadron, warned his government of
our lack of everything that is necessary for a navy, such as supplies, ammunition, coal, provisions, etc. We have nothing at all.
A provocative act against America, such as sinking the Maine, was clearly the last thing desired by the Spanish. But who did want to sink the Maine? Detectives often solve crimes by examining who profited from them. To help finance the war, the Rockefellers' National City Bank loaned the U.S. government $200 million. No income tax then existed. To help repay the loan, the telephone use tax was levied on the American people. It remained in effect for over a century. The loan was negotiated by Assistant Treasury Secretary Frank Vanderlip. After the war, National City Bank made Vanderlip its president. In that capacity, as we will see, he participated in the infamous Jekyll Island meeting, where the Federal Reserve Bank was secretly created. Mark Twain wrote,
"When the smoke was over, the dead buried, and the cost of the war came back to the people, it suddenly dawned on us that the cause of the Spanish-American War was the price of sugar."
The Rockefeller-Stillman National City Bank benefited most directly from it. For Cuba, soon afterwards, became dotted with national city branches, and the Cuban sugar industry gravitated into national cities' hands.
The Spanish-American War was the first war that persuaded Americans that the purpose of our military was not just self-defense, but we had to go overseas and fight wars on other people's behalf, and that became a pattern that continued ever since.
So without William Randolph Hearst, who championed this and who maybe was one of the people that stood to gain from the new possession game from the Spanish-American War, without him and without Hearst newspapers, there would have been no problem with Maine.
The phrase false flag, I think, is becoming more and more familiar to more Americans than it used to be. First time I ever heard that was probably about 20 years ago. I thought, what does this mean? I think many Americans are still in that category. What does that mean?
Well, first off, so people understand what we're talking about with false flag, that goes back to the days of the old sailing ships, and everybody had their country's flag. The idea was, it took a long time to sailing ships to approach each other, and so they wanted to get up close so they could attack, and so they would put another country's flag up. Say they were pirates, they'd put a British flag up, and they'd get right next to you, and then they'd run up the pirate flag and towards the ship, so that's where it became known as a false flag. The event seems to be something other than what it truly is.
False flags, when you cover them, first of all, it's a tough term to even use, right? Because as soon as you say false flag, you've started conditioning people to see that as conspiratorial. And when anything's conspiratorial, that means it's not true, right? Because if you listen to most media, conspiracy theorists or conspiracies are all urban legends, right? They're all myths. When in fact, there are many, many conspiracies all throughout American history and world history.
It's not even controversial to say that the United States has used false flag because it's now documented. It's a part of history.
General Smedley Butler wrote a book after World War I that I've read, and I know many of your viewers have as well, War is a Racket. And indeed, in many ways it is. And I think that we have noticed over the years that some of the events that led up to war were not accidental.
I found myself going back and looking at World War I, World War
We
II,
use motherfuckers.
the Vietnam War,
Very
everything.
used.
We've been lied to about everything, and that was my fearful kind of approach to this is that even possible?
I would say they always follow a specific formula of create as much fear and trauma as possible, and then in that traumatization of the public, they're eliciting a specific psychological response. That response is a cry for protection.
False flags have always been necessary to generate the kind of fear of outsiders or the imagined enemy that governments need in order to support the ridiculous policy of war in the first place.
Stage 1 is brute force. Stage 2 is staging something or creating an external enemy so that you can come to rescue and people will say your fear. And then stage 3 is really getting to the point
Now they're trying to do it September 11th. Being blowed up.
many people through psychological manipulation.
When you think about all the lies, how can you trust the
1915,
system that's
World War I is underway.
How can you trust a
Britain
doctor
is at war
knowing
with
that they're lying
Germany.
to you too?
America has not yet joined the contest. May 7th, the British ocean liner RMS Lusitania is on her way from New York to England. Nearly 200 Americans are among the passengers. 2:10 p.m., off Ireland's southern coast, a torpedo from a German U-boat strikes the Lusitania. More than 1,000 on board lose their lives. On both sides of the Atlantic, the public is told the Germans sank the Lusitania simply to kill women and children. The tragedy fans outrage and moves America closer to declaring war. In propaganda, Germany replaces Spain as the eighth.
And because nearly every conflict the U.S. has been involved in the 20th century has been based on a false flag pretext event, and the Lusitania is no different. That's how they got us into World War I.
At the time, statesmen, senators, the American people in general wanted to mind their own business. They had a great industrial engine inside the United States. They were able to freely trade throughout the world and had no reason to engage in World War I. It wasn't their business. But unfortunately, the money powers had other interests at hand.
At that point in the war, passenger ships and merchantmen would be armed. They would give orders to ram submarines. The submarines had no choice but to fire without warning.
Why did the Germans really sink the Lusitania? Because her hull was loaded with munitions. 6 million rounds of rifle ammunition, over 50 tons of shrapnel shells, and more than 60 tons of military explosives, including aluminum powder and gun cotton. The Lusitania was struck by a single torpedo, followed moments later by a massive explosion. The mighty ship disappeared beneath the waves in just 18 minutes. At the U.S. hearing investigating the incident, a critical piece of evidence went missing. President Woodrow Wilson ordered that the Lusitania's original manifest listing her munitions be hidden in the archives of the U.S. Treasury. Even more significant, evidence the Lusitania was deliberately sent to her doom.
The Lusitania was hauling munitions to the British that were going to be used against Germany in the war. And so the Germans took it out of the game.
Prior to the incident, Winston Churchill, then head of the British Admiralty, had ordered a study done to determine the political impact if the Germans sank a British passenger ship with Americans on board. President Woodrow Wilson's top advisor, Edward Mandell House, was in England at the time as Wilson's emissary. In the morning, on the day the Lusitania sank, House met with Edward Grey, Britain's foreign minister. House recorded.
We spoke of the probability of an ocean liner being sunk, and I told him if this were done, a flame of indignation would sweep across America, which would in itself probably carry us into the war.
House and Grey then met with King George V at Buckingham Palace. House wrote,
We fell to talking, strangely enough, of the probability of Germany sinking a transatlantic liner. The king said,
Suppose they should sink the Lusitania, with American passengers on board.
That afternoon, the Lusitania was torpedoed. The British Admiralty had been well aware of a U-boat's presence in the South Irish Sea, from decoded intercepts of German naval communications and reports of the sub's activity in that region. Contrary to protocol, no warships were sent to escort the Lusitania, even though 4 destroyers were lying idle in the nearby port of Milford Haven. Commander Joseph Kenworthy, then in British Naval Intelligence, wrote,
The Lusitania was sent at considerably reduced speed into an area where a U-boat was known to be waiting, with her escorts withdrawn.
2 leading books in this affair are The Lusitania by British historian Colin Simpson and Room 40 by Patrick Beasley. Beasley, considered the leading authority on the history of British naval intelligence, wrote,
I am reluctantly driven to the conclusion that there was a conspiracy deliberately to put the Lusitania at risk in the hopes that even an abortive attack on her would bring the United States into the war.
When the ship was blown up containing American passengers, it became the raison d'entrée into World War I. It was an outrageous and insidious enough event that Americans were reluctantly able to muster themselves and enter the war.
I think the most stunning example where there is so much historical evidence that no one even challenges anymore is the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Every time that anniversary comes around, we focus on Pearl Harbor Day because we want people to know the truth and want them to stop buying into the lies.
December 7, 1941, the Japanese Navy attacks the United States fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, sinking or heavily damaging 18 naval vessels and leaving over 2,000 Americans dead. This is the event that propels America into World War II.
I had pretty much the same view that most Americans have, and that it was a dastardly attack, as President Roosevelt said. It was a day of infamy.
It goes down in history now. We're having been such a sad, sad time.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Congress declares war, but the public wants to know why America was caught off guard. President Roosevelt appoints a commission to answer this question. The Roberts Commission was headed by Owen Roberts, a Supreme Court justice friendly with Roosevelt. The Roberts Commission declared that Washington officials had discharged their duties in an exemplary fashion. The fault for Pearl Harbor, it concluded, lay with their commanders in Hawaii, Pacific Fleet Commander Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter C. Short, the Army commanders in Hawaii. It's alleged these men failed to take adequate defensive and surveillance measures. The words dereliction of duty blazed on headlines across the country. Kimmel and Short were flooded with hate mail and received multiple death threats. It was claimed their negligence caused the deaths of thousands of Americans. Some members of Congress said the pair should be shot. Kimmel and Short, however, protested the Roberts Commission findings. Roberts had run an unusual hearing. Initially, evidence was heard without being recorded. Statements not made under oath. Kimmel and Short were denied the right to question witnesses or have fellow officers serve as legal counsel. The Commission's report omitted significant testimony.
But we know behind the scenes that FDR knew quite a bit more. He was warned. And even behind that, FDR's shadow cabinet of advisors in the Council on Foreign Relations were provocating things behind the scenes. The American people were never meant to know the truth.
In 1944, a congressional resolution mandated the trials. That August, the Navy Court of Inquiry and the Army Pearl Harbor Board convened. At these proceedings, the attorneys for Kimmel and Short presented proof that Washington had complete foreknowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack, but had withheld this information from their commanders in Hawaii.
We needed one thing, which our own resources would not make available to us. That vital need was the information available in Washington from the intercepted dispatches, which told when and where Japan would probably strike. It is my conviction that action for the Navy Department at any one of these significant dates in furnishing me the information from the intercepted messages would have altered the events of December 7, 1941.
Outraged, the Navy Court exonerated Admiral Kimmel and laid the blame squarely on Washington, D.C. The Army Pearl Harbor Board concluded Washington had full foreknowledge of the attack. Its report closed with these words.
Up to the morning of December 7, 1941, everything that the Japanese were planning to do was known to the United States.
But the American people did not learn the results. The Roosevelt administration ordered the trial verdicts to be made confidential.
He discovered later that his own superiors had gone to great lengths to make sure that he, Admiral Kimmel, did not have the information that was available in Washington.
Why was the fleet in Pearl Harbor when Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered the U.S. Pacific Fleet to move from the west coast to Pearl Harbor? The fleet commander, J.O. Richardson, went to Washington and he protested this decision. He said, Mr. President, our ships will be boxed in like sardines in Pearl Harbor. Hawaii is approachable from 360 degrees by potential attackers. We'll have to resupply across 2,000 miles of the Pacific. The only reason President Roosevelt forgave Richardson for putting the fleet in Pearl Harbor was he said it would deter Japanese aggression. Well, as of December the 7th, 1941, everyone knew that putting the fleet in Pearl Harbor did not deter Japanese aggression.
A breakthrough came in 1982 with the publication of Infamy by John Toland, the Pulitzer Prize winner known as the Dean of World War II historians. By the time of Toland's book, witnesses and information had emerged that had been previously unavailable. How did Washington know Pearl Harbor was coming? First, through decoded diplomatic messages. The Japanese used a code called Purple to communicate with their embassies and major consulates. Its complexity required enciphering and deciphering by machine. The Japanese considered the code unbreakable. But in 1940, U.S. Army cryptanalysts cracked it and devised a facsimile of the Japanese machine. As a result, U.S. intelligence was reading Japanese diplomatic messages, often on a same-day basis. Copies of the deciphered text were promptly delivered to President Roosevelt, as well as Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall and Secretary of State Cordell Hull. These messages revealed that the Japanese planned to rupture relations with America and had ordered their Berlin embassy to inform the Germans, their allies, that
the breaking out of war may come quicker than anyone dreams. We were not going to go back into Europe because it had cost so many American lives in World War I, which was already dubbed the war to end all wars. Why would we possibly go back again when the American people knew full well it wasn't in their interest?
Pearl Harbor was absolutely necessary because, like all Democrats, FDR ran on a non-intervention and no-war platform. There's absolutely no way that the people would have again been sucked into this meat grinder.
So although that is not classically a false flag, because the Japanese actually did the attack, it fits under that umbrella because we find out that the U.S. government wanted the Japanese to attack.
They left certain ships all next to each other so they could be more easily hit, and got the more expensive and newer and more capable ships out of there so that they would not become collateral damage.
Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe was the U.S. military observer in Java, then under Dutch control. In early December 1941, the Dutch Army declared a Japanese dispatch forecasting an attack on Hawaii. They passed the information to Thorpe, who was so alarmed he sent Washington a total of 4 warnings. Finally, the War Department ordered him to send no further warnings regarding Pearl Harbor. Dusko Papa was a Yugoslavian double agent whose true allegiance was to the Allies. Through contact with the Germans, Papa realized the Japanese were planning to bomb Pearl Harbor. He notified the FBI. Subsequently, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover stated that he had passed this information on to Roosevelt.
And it's in you to come out.
Iowa Senator Guy Gillette and Texas Congressman Martin Dies also later stated they had received advance information concerning the attack, which they shared with the president. Roosevelt told them to leave it in his hands.
It's not nice, people.
In Day of Deceit, The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor, Robert Stennett proved from documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act that Washington was not only deciphering Japanese diplomatic messages, but naval dispatches also. The most significant was sent by Admiral Yamamoto to the Japanese First Air Fleet on November 26th.
Fair use, niggas. Fair use. This is how the music go with the bullshit.
Maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft shall advance into Hawaiian waters, and upon the very opening of hostility shall attack the main force of the United States, fleet and deal in the Moron Road. The first air raid is planned for the dawn of next day. Exact date to be given by later order.
Whether we're looking at something like Pearl Harbor, which is now an admitted false flag event, or if it's an event that was clearly allowed to occur, it was known about and no action was taken to prevent it or stop it. So that could qualify as a false flag event. Whether you're looking at an event like the Gulf of Tonkin, which was a fake false flag event. It was something that we were told occurred and actually didn't even occur. This has been called by some researchers, like Peter Knight, for example, as no problem reaction solution. You don't even have to have the actual physical event take place. You only need the perception of it to take place.
In retaliation for this unprovoked attack on the high seas, our forces have struck the bases used by the North Vietnamese patrol craft.
In many cases, these individuals who plan these events, they're playing chess. Well, we're not even playing checkers yet. You
know? You have to understand what they're doing. The event isn't as important as the underlying psychology the event is done to elicit. And until we understand that pattern, we're not going to be streetwise to the technique.
In the event of a further attack upon our vessels in international waters, we are to respond with the objective of destroying the attackers.
Look at those Vietnamese, man, up in north. We got to stop them right away. If we don't stop those communist North Vietnamese, they're going to take over South Vietnam, then Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and before you know it, those dominoes will be falling until they hit the shores of California. Now, you could say I sound like a lunatic for saying something so stupid, but that's what was being said back then, and I know firsthand because I was prime draft age at that time.
These guys are professionals at it. They know how to take advantage of it. And, of course, one of the most horrible ones in our lifetime was in August of '64 when Lyndon Johnson faked the Gulf of Tonkin.
In 1964, Congress passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, authorizing President Lyndon Johnson to escalate the Vietnam War, to which he committed hundreds of thousands of troops. The justification given for the resolution was two alleged attacks on U.S. destroyers by Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Tonkin Gulf, August 2nd and August 4th, 1964. Johnson described the first attack as an unprovoked assault against a routine patrol. Actually, the destroyer was supporting a South Vietnamese military operation against the North. The second attack never occurred. Admiral James Stockdale, recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, was then a pilot stationed in the Tonkin Gulf. Later shot down and spent 7 years in a POW camp. After returning home, he summarized his experiences in his book, In Love with War. Stockdale was called to the scene of the alleged August 4th attack that saw no Vietnamese boats during 1.5 hours of overtime.
Well, I was over those destroyers for over an hour and a half, below 1,000 feet, lights on, watching everything they did. I could hear them chatting on the radio, the Maddox and the Joy. They seemed to have some intermittent radar targets. I took it upon myself to get out there where they thought a boat was and try to kill it if they didn't. But it was fruitless. And I'd go down there and there was nothing.
I felt it was a bad portent that we seemed to be under the control of a mindless Washington bureaucracy, vain enough to pick their own legitimacies regardless of the evidence.
Today, very few people dispute that the Tonkin Gulf incident didn't take place.
Later, it was revealed that the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was written before the alleged incident. The document was simply awaiting on an excuse to activate it.
The whole Gulf of Tonkin incident, a lie by slimy little people like Robert McNamara and LBJ. And every one of those people knew it was a lie, and they sacrificed the lives of 60,000 American boys, destroyed the lives, limbs, and minds of hundreds of thousands of others, killed over 3 million Vietnamese, napalmed in Agent Orange on lives.
They died in a just cause for defending freedom, and they will not have died in vain.
The main justification currently given for the Iraq War, bringing freedom and democracy to the Iraqi people, was not the original reason presented.
The next mushroom cloud you'd see. One of Saddam Hussein's weapons. You remember that one?
Last November 8th, this council passed Resolution 1441 by unanimous vote. The purpose of that resolution was to disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction.
It was claimed Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, threatening world security.
This council placed the burden on Iraq to comply and disarm, and not on the inspectors to find that which Iraq has gone out of its way to conceal for so long.
There is only one truth, and therefore, I tell you, as I have said on many occasions before, that Iraq has no weapons of mass destruction whatsoever.
After the invasion, Chief U.S. Weapons Inspector David Kay acknowledged months of searching had turned up no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. In his opinion, they hadn't existed there since the 1991 Gulf War.
Why aren't there any war crime tribunals, Inspector? Who knew what when?
Either you were with us, or you were with the terrorists.
An interview with Scott Ritter, who was the UN's chief weapons inspector in Iraq, who affirmed that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq after the original Gulf War of 1991.
Weapons of mass destruction, I thought, you know, who could believe this? I mean, who's believing this Yellow Cape from Niger story and the whole thing?
And still no accountability for the fact that we went into another country looking for weapons that weren't there, and we killed 500,000 people. One thing that the Bush administration did a very good job of, with the help of media, was to shift the focus away from any reality of weapons, terrorism. So what they did was the administration immediately shifted to we're bringing democracy.
Part of the reason we went into Iraq was the main reason we went into Iraq at the time was we thought he had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he didn't, but he had the capacity to make weapons of mass destruction. But I also talked about the human suffering. And I also talked the need to advance a freedom agenda.
And still to this day, there are people, especially neocons, who believe that all these wars that we've had in the Middle East, which have again turned the Middle East into chaos, that have handed it over to Al-Qaeda so that we can go back, I guess, and fight them again later there. It was done so that freedom could come to an oppressed people.
Colin Powell, who made such definite assertions before the UN, has admitted his claims were based on faulty intelligence.
The little lying Colin Powell putting up phony information in front of the UN. He's a Saddam Hussein's mobile weapons of mass destruction lab. It's one lie after another.
Looking at these wars, Spanish-American, World War II, Vietnam, and Iraq, one could soundly argue that in each war, American involvement was based on a deception, false pretext, or to put it charitably, mistaken pretext.
One lie after another. Keep pouring them out. These are sick people and nobody wants to call a spade a spade.
Could this really be one giant coincidence? Patterns of this scale generally do not happen by accident. To find the answer, deeper questions remain.
When our country was founded, it was founded by an elite group. The founding fathers were the educated ones, the ones that had land, the ones who had studied in Europe, the ones who had read history and philosophy. And thank God it was that way. It's still true in America today, but the elite has changed.
It's a great debate of whether or not we're founded on our lineage and our heritage of the Constitution and Bill of Rights or from hidden measures.
Who runs the country? Well, political parties run the country, but we all know that political parties actually don't do anything on their own.
I think the reality is that we're probably ruled, for the most part, by an oligarchy.
People still elect members of Congress, but beyond that, once someone is in Congress, special interest groups take over, the lobbying firms take over, very wealthy families take over, and the people have absolutely no voice.
A super elite, very powerful, very wealthy individuals who have, I will use the word, conspired together to take advantage of the opportunities afforded them in their positions of power and influence to pretty much determine the direction and the course of our country, irrespective of the wishes of the American people.
I think in any culture, in any country, you can look to who has the money. The people with the money typically tend to wield the power. And the best way to do that is to do it from behind the scenes, because then if people become angry with the way power is being wielded, they don't come after you, they come after the puppet standing in front of you.
We all know about a lot of wealthy people, Warren Buffett and Donald Trump, and but these are the guys that you hear about. The people, they've got lots of money, yeah, but the people with the real power, you don't even hear their names.
We start seeing all of these names of large corporations that come together over and over again, and then they get intertwined into events that take place, and we start to see there's a pattern and there is a real agenda.
In America's 60 Families, Ferdinand Lundberg wrote,
The United States is owned and dominated by a hierarchy of its 60 richest families, functioning discreetly in a de jure democratic form of government, behind which a de facto government, absolutist and plutocratic, has gradually taken form. This de facto government is actually the government of the United States, informal, invisible, shadowy.
Among the 60 families Lundberg named were the Rockefellers, Morgans, Mellons, Vanderbilts, DuPonts, Astors, and Warburgs. Through inherited fortunes, they remained entrenched in power from one generation to the next. These families frequently acted in concert to pre-select presidential candidates of both Republican and Democratic parties, and, as Lundberg documented, acquired sweeping ownership of America's major newspapers.
For the last several decades, let's admit, the powers that be have pretty much been the ones that have really made the decisions irrespective of the will of the American people.
This power structure has been called the establishment. Syndicated columnist Edith Kermit Roosevelt, granddaughter of President Theodore Roosevelt, described it.
Establishment is a general term for the power elite in international finance, business, and government, who wield most of the power regardless of who is in the White House. Most people are unaware of the existence of this legitimate mafia, yet the power of the establishment makes itself felt from the professor who seeks a foundation grant to the candidate for a cabinet post or State Department job. It affects the nation's policies in almost every area.
In America, in principle, power is supposed to belong to the people. Voting sustains the public perception that it retains power. However, the establishment has ways of getting around our electoral system. First, through their influence within the major parties as well as the media, they can usually predetermine the Democratic and Republican nominees for president.
For years, I would tell people, if you don't go vote, you haven't got any right to gripe about what goes on, because you're just not even part of the process. But I've quit saying that, because now, even if you do go vote, in many instances, it doesn't really matter.
Oh, and I love the baloney that they keep shoving out every election. Now, if you don't vote, then you get what you deserve. No, if you vote, you get what you deserve. The lesser of two evils? What sick person would vote for a lesser of two evils?
In 1976, Jimmy Carter was elected president. 7 months before the Democratic convention, the Gallup poll reported less than 4% of registered Democrats favored Carter for president. Outside Georgia, where he was governor, few people knew who he was. What happened?
There's a new mood in America. We've been shaken by a tragic war abroad and by scandals and broken promises at home.
Carter received a media blitz, including adulatory pieces in the New York Times and a Wall Street Journal editorial declaring him the best Democratic candidate. The TV networks inundated the public with his image. Before the nominating convention, his picture appeared on Times cover 3 times and Newsweek's cover twice. Times cover artists were instructed to make him look as much like John F. Kennedy as possible. How did Carter acquire this media following? It began with dinner at the Tarrytown, New York estate of David Rockefeller. Present was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who helped Rockefeller found the Internationalist Trilateral Commission, and whom Carter would later appoint National Security Advisor. Senator Barry Goldwater said of this meeting,
David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski found Jimmy Carter to be their ideal candidate. They helped him win the nomination and the presidency. To accomplish this purpose, they mobilized the money power of the Wall Street bankers and the media controllers.
Carter thus received the nomination. A similar process has anointed campaigns of other major party presidential nominees of the last few decades.
The people have no real say, including in who is elected to office in this country. I mean, consider this. In the United States, about 50% of the population are no longer affiliated with Republicans and Democrats. So 50% of the population is not voting for Republicans or Democrats. Tell me which national election, member of the House, member of the U.S. Senate, president has been elected in the last 100 years who was not a member of one of those parties. Now, how is it possible that half the country isn't voting for Republicans or Democrats because they're not affiliated with those parties, and yet those are the only two options that we still have? And that, I think that demonstrates to people how corrupt the system is, because you are literally kept from having any other option and any other choice.
Because of the manipulation of the mainstream media, public education, most of the entertainment world, as well as the political world, so many of the American people are sedated, and they do not engage in the areas in which they could make a difference.
The good news is, I think we're hitting a tipping point where the people, you're now hitting critical mass, obviously, when we have 50% of the country that's no longer a part of it, where, it just takes a very small minority now to really push things in a different direction.
We had George Bush trying to get reelected, and John Kerry was his adversary, allegedly. As it turned out, there was massive electronic vote fraud in one of the swing states, Ohio. It turned out that John Kerry actually won. It was given to Bush. A year or so later, there's a young law student down in the University of Florida, and John Kerry is speaking down there. And the law student had the cojones to go over and get in front of the microphone when they asked him, when they opened it to questions. And he asked John Kerry, how come he didn't make more of a squawk about it?
You won the 2004 election. Isn't that amazing? Instead of making you won in 2004.
So obviously he had won. The difference between not only him being president, but what the different party would be in, and it was a very powerful question. You know what the response was? John Kerry gave a little nod or something, because the next thing you know, there's a goon squad of about 6 that go and drag the young law student right out of the law class.
However, the establishment has an even more powerful means of influencing the will of the people. The most important is the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, headquartered in New York City. Though virtually unknown to the public, the council dominates cabinets of both Republican and Democratic presidents.
When you look at where the wires are connected to the centers of power, you will find again and again that places like the Council on Foreign Relations don't just float ideas, they provide solutions.
You often find members of the Council on Foreign Relations being appointed to various positions in government or industry, for that matter, and you see them in the revolving door going back and forth between business and, regulatory agencies and stuff like that. The big question is, how substantive is the CFR on global affairs?
Since its founding in 1921, the CFR has produced 21 Secretaries of War and Defense, 19 Treasury Secretaries, 18 Secretaries of State, and 16 CIA Directors. And what is the Council's goal?
The Council on Foreign Relations is a fairly interesting entity to me. And the reason for that is because they have so many members of the CFR who are in media.
I think the CFR exerts tremendous influence over our government, our media, and our centers of education, more so than most people would want to admit.
The Council on Foreign Relations is a very important nexus point, but it's just a vehicle for the larger aims of those who have the agenda. But it's an important vehicle. It's a ring of power that is an engine to encircle the whole world.
Once in a while there'll be a spokesperson on major media. He'll be introduced as such and so, and they'll give the credentials and what mention a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. But that just, it sounds so inaccurate to just pass it, it's the Council that deals with foreign policy. People don't remember that.
The number one thing people need to know is that when you have so many members of media who are a part of those organizations or that organization, you have lost the ability to have anyone criticize globalist agenda or globalist viewpoints, because they are members of an organization that pronounces its view is to create, globalism.
They have seized upon foreign policy, economics, and trade to get around the bounds of the Constitution and put their global system on top of America.
Well, when I wrote The Shadow of Power, main concern I had was that maybe I'd gone too far in attributing our foreign policy to this visiting government. Now it's 26 years later, we've had the arrival of the internet, we've had access to information I never had access to at the time I wrote that book. And my conclusion is that it's not that I went too far, but I didn't go far enough. When the Council on Foreign Relations was formed and the decision was made at a dinner at the Majestic Hotel in Paris in 1919 after the bankers got the word that the Senate had rejected the Versailles Treaty, so we weren't going to become embroiled in the League of Nations. So there was an organization created. It was in Britain, it was the Royal Institute of International Affairs. In America, it was the Council on Foreign Relations, like sister organizations.
These roundtable groups were put into formation to steer nations and steer their policies, rather than control them overtly through direct leadership. They worked through secret maneuvers. The Cecil Rhodes Secret Foundation Trust had been involved not in nation building, but in nation manufacturing in the southern part of Africa. And now they wanted the entire world.
Now, how do they control American government policy? The number one way is by serving as a recruiting ground, the recruiting ground for cabinet-level positions. You probably noticed that a lot of people in U.S. cabinets come from the big multinational corporations. How does that happen? Well, the Council on Foreign Relations will invite executives from Citibank or Exxon or Halliburton and Bechtel into the council. We'll attend maybe a study group, attend some dinners, hear some speeches by people like Henry Kissinger, Vivian Brzezinski. Now they become experts on policy, and now you see them showing up at the State Department or another major department. When you have one organization controlling the cabinet with a uniform viewpoint, whether the president is Republican, Democrat, naturally you're going to get uniform policies.
Here are some of the prominent members of the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, Sandra Day O'Connor, Dick Cheney, Les Aspin, Colin Powell, Robert Gates, Brent Scowcroft, Jesse Jackson Sr., Muriel Cuomo, Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, David Brinkley, John Chancellor, Marvin Cowell, Diane Sawyer, Barbara Walters, Cyrus Vance, Paul Volcker, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Bruce Babbitt, Howard Baker, Samuel Berger, Elaine Chao, Dianne Feinstein, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Chuck Hagel, Gary Hart, John McCain, George Mitchell, Bill Moyers, Jay Rockefeller, Donna Shalala, Strobe Talbot, Fred Thompson, Robert Zoellick, Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, George McGovern, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, John Anderson, Walter Mondale, Michael Dukakis, Al Gore, John Kerry, on and on. I mean, you notice first of all that you're talking Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals. You're talking people in every area of government and news media. You're talking education establishment. You're talking basically the key establishment institutions of the country are all infiltrated with Council on Foreign Relations members. Why is this institution so powerful that no matter whether it's Republican or Democrat in the White House, they are going to fill their administration with members of the CFR?
Admiral Chester Ward, former Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Navy, was a CFR member for 16 years. Before resigning in disgust, he stated the Council's objective.
Submergence of U.S. sovereignty into an all-powerful one-world government. This lust to surrender the sovereignty and independence of the United States is pervasive throughout most of the membership.
This is a man who was also invited to become part of the CFR and was a member for a few years until he recognized what the CFR was all about. After finding that out, he withdrew his membership from the CFR, and then he did his best to inform the American people as to what the CFR was all about.
The Council's journal, Foreign Affairs, has pushed for world government for over 90 years. In its first year of publication, 1922, it declared, obviously, there's going to be no peace or prosperity for mankind so long as it remains divided into 50 or 60 independent states. The real problem today is that of world government.
When you put all of that together, you recognize that the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, as nothing more but an elaborate attempt to, as they say themselves, make an end run around national sovereignty, diminish the independence and autonomy of the United States, and merge it into this global governing institution that they, of course, foresee themselves running.
Well, my goodness, we're going toward everybody having a little bit and nobody having a whole lot, except for the elite. And we're going towards seeing all of our jobs taken away and put into another country. That's your world government for you. That's not benefiting the people in this country. So I absolutely, I abhor the idea of world government. And I'm afraid that what we're going to see is the demise of many of our countries in the attempt to formulate this one big structure.
And it's obvious to see, okay, there are these very rich and powerful people meeting at, under the guise of the CFR or the Bilderberg Group or a bunch of other things. But it really doesn't matter. The fact is, the superclass exists. That's the problem.
So whether it's a Brussels, whether it's a World Trade Organization, whatever it might be, it's still built on the premise of how do we steal the most amount of money that we can, put it in the hands of the fewest, and tell everybody else what to do.
It's not primarily driven by political ambition. It's driven by economic ambition. And just the fact that I mentioned that might change the flavor of the conversation, because talking about economics is a little bit different than just talking about politics. And one of the reasons, again, that the American experiment here is not working too well right now as far as Congress is concerned is because Congress is not an economic animal, it's a political animal.
What is world government? Simply stated, one regime ruling the planet.
I don't think anything's intrinsically wrong with the one world government. In fact, I think obviously we are just one humanity, and eventually we're going to get to that. I can see perfectly well that there'll come a time when somebody's going to say, "Hey, where are you from?" And you're going to say, "I'm from Earth." Okay, but the problem is, are we going to do this voluntarily? Are we all going to agree that we're going to have a world government, and that we all have some sort of representation, and the thing's done equitably and fairly, or are we going to have a handful of wealthy, egotistical, sometimes psychopathic people who want to control the world, who are going to force it off on us? And unfortunately, this is what's happening right now.
I think what any subject of the New World Order would have to be concerned with is who basically is going to end up calling the shots.
Obviously, most people aren't thinking it all the way through. They have to realize that there's a difference between just saying we should have world government to put an end to war, and then asking the next question, but wait a minute, what kind of world government will this be? It might even be worse than war.
Countries act as a check and balance on each other. If one nation becomes despotic, another nation can rise up and stop it. If you had a one world government, it would set up the most unrestrained tyranny in history.
Already in the United States, with a population of over 300 million, you may be able to meet your representative, but your likelihood of knowing your representative as an average citizen is next to nothing. You may not even know who he or she is.
It only works in utopia. And so while this is something we might all strive for, without a massive shift in global consciousness, it's impossible.
Such a development is less remote than it may sound at first. It is being established progressively now. Modeled in Europe, where once mighty nations that oversaw empires, such as Britain and Spain, are becoming more like provinces of the European Union. Parliaments of EU countries grow increasingly subservient to the European Parliament. Laws are becoming more uniform throughout the Union. National currencies are consolidating into the euro. The European Court of Justice can issue arrest warrants against citizens of member countries. Advocates of world government are planning a universal version of the EU model for the entire planet.
When you give up your identity as an individual nation, what you're essentially doing is giving up the identity of your people and the individuals within your society. Now they're just part of this kind of globalist worldview, and they don't have values anymore. So when we see what's happening in the Veneto region, when we see Scotland now saying they're looking for independence, when we see Catalonia saying they want independence, if you believe in individual liberty, you should celebrate those movements. Because what those entities are essentially saying, as people, as individuals, we believe that we're more than just a member of your larger European Union, your larger global union. And instead, we want to be able to create goods and services, be paid for our labor, be paid for our work, and if we have to pay taxes, we should see a return on those taxes within our own communities. In a globalist world, you never see that return.
Globalists justify world government by promising peace and prosperity. Their traditional argument has been that nothing is worse than war. And wars occur because the world is divided into nations who keep fighting. They say if we replace nations with a world government, war would end. And mankind would live as one happy family in peace and prosperity. However, this pretext is flawed. Rudolph Rummel, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Hawaii, published a study demonstrating that in the 20th century, 6 times more people were killed by their own governments than by wars. In other words, wars are not the deadliest thing. Governments are.
What we know from the 20th century, that in nation after nation after nation, governments that became extraordinarily powerful had a very disconcerting tendency to kill their population. So you can look, for example, at the Soviet Union under Stalin, 60 million people killed. You can look at China under Mao Zedong. Some estimates say well over 100 million people killed. Some even say 200 million people killed. You can look at Nazi Germany as the example that probably most viewers are familiar with. Example after example, even ones that most people haven't even heard of.
The problem with world government is the same problem as with any government. Government is controlled by force. The more you concentrate that power, the worse it is. You could make the case that world government might be only as bad as local government, but obviously the bigger, the more concentrated that exploitation racket becomes, the greater chance there is for corruption.
All human authority is jurisdictional and limited. So whenever you violate that and you create a regional government, and then a multi-regional government, and then a global government, by very nature you have squelched and expunged the fundamental tenets and principles of liberty, natural rights, freedom, sovereignty, under the states, individuals. It's all gone.
If we had a world government, who would run it? Globalists like to point out that international alliances have defeated dictators like Saddam Hussein. But what if a man like Hussein took over a world government? Today, if a tyrant enslaves a nation, its people may hopefully escape to another country. But if a dictator ruled a world government, where could anyone escape? America's founding fathers recognized the dangers of concentrating power. They therefore split government power into 3 branches. In the Founding Fathers' original vision, the power of the entire federal government would be held in check by the states. Decentralization of power has spared Americans the oppression of totalitarian dictatorships that other nations have known. James Madison, known as the father of the U.S. Constitution, said,
"The accumulation of all power, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny."
If we follow the money to see who is behind the Council on Foreign Relations, it becomes clear that the U.S. foreign policy establishment is intimately linked to Wall Street and the banking establishment. Americans know they have inflation. In 1962, a postage stamp cost 4 cents. Today, 49. A candy bar cost a nickel in 1962, now around $1. Since 1913, the dollar's purchasing power has declined over 95%. Inflation is not inevitable. This graph depicts American price levels since 1665. There was no net inflation for the first 250 years. Inflationary blips occurred as during the American Revolution, War of 1812, and Civil War, when the United States printed large quantities of money to pay for those conflicts. Increasing the supply of money diminishes its value, making prices rise. But notice after the wars, money always returned to its normal value. A dollar was the same in 1900 as 1770. During World War I, our currency inflated, but instead of resuming to its normal value afterwards, American dollars, stable for 250 years, began rapidly and permanently losing value. This change came from one factor: creation of the Federal Reserve Bank in 1913.
The Federal Reserve is the most important part of the American government's racket of exploitation, and that's important to remember, that it's not about the wars, it's not about the police state, it's not about the business regulations. Those are all how. Why? Power and money.
Time to pay attention, because the Federal Reserve has taken over the engine of the country and completely made it subservient to interest other than the actual country.
First off, it's not federal, and second off, it has no reserves. Okay, so the whole thing's a fraud to begin with.
The Constitution gives the Congress the power to coin money, but we've lost that by giving our power to a private corporation.
Janet Yellen is current chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. She was preceded by Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan. The Fed chairman has been called America's economic czar, largely because the chairman and board set U.S. interest rates, which impacts the stock market. If interest rates rise, CDs and other interest-bearing securities appear more profitable, causing money to flow away from the riskier stock market. However, when interest rates fall, investors tend to favor stocks.
Janet Yellen, the Fed chair, the new Fed chair, is going around saying that she will continue these policies of this quantitative easing, as it's called, which is essentially just the printing of money. And they're going to continue it until they can get the unemployment rates down. And she gives examples. She's talking like a president now, giving examples of the young woman that she's met in this community who struggles because she works multiple jobs. She's a single mom, and it's very difficult for her. Yeah, well, I'm sure it is difficult for her. But what no one ever tells you in media is that the reason that we have so many people struggling in this country is due in large part to the Federal Reserve Bank.
People who are closest to the money are the ones who get the greatest benefit. So whoever's had their hands on not just the Federal Reserve, but the whole infrastructure around it, the global banks that are peddling the Federal Reserve notes and the bonds and treasury bills and so on, the Goldman Sachs of the world, the J.P. Morgans and so on. These companies and these individuals have consistently gotten rich beyond anybody's wildest imagination. The rest of us consistently have gotten poorer beyond our wildest imagination as well, so that the value of the dollar today is somewhere around 1.5% of what it was in 1913.
You know, the United States dollar, the Federal Reserve note dollar, has lost 98% of its value in the last 100 years. So, if, number one, your first mandate is to protect the value of the currency, you failed. The second mandate on unemployment, as I mentioned, when the Fed chair is talking about this family that's in need and she wants to help them, how does the Federal Reserve help them? By holding interest rates low? That doesn't help families. That doesn't put food on my table. If anything, it makes it more difficult because there are more people out there saying, well, then you should go get a loan right now, borrow more money right now.
As has been stated in history, you know, whoever controls the money controls.
Again, it goes back to the money. It's not a world government, it's the bankers in charge. And again, the distribution of wealth right now in the United States, as everyone knows, is worse than it was at the Gilded Age over 100 years ago.
They are creating currency out of nothing with absolutely no value to it, promising us that, number one, this will lead to greater wealth across the nation, which it's proven it cannot do. And number two, it will also create employment, which it cannot do.
The Federal Reserve has the power to issue and create currency, but this gives it an inside track to give money at very low, if any, interest rates to its member banks, to the members of the oligarchy who control that bank. Meanwhile, it loans money to the country at interest, making incredible profits and making certain that the United States can never be sovereign again so long as the Federal Reserve exists.
Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to one of his friends after he was out of office, he said, whenever public servants are paid by something other than what the people produce, the roles of master and servant are reversed.
With the central bank, everything becomes consolidated in their view. It goes back to, again, 4 simple words. It's too big, too fair. Central banks, look what they've done. They're robbing the people right in front of everybody's eyes as we speak.
The Fed was established when Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. The original legislation was introduced by Senator Nelson Aldrich, a frontman of the banking community. Few Americans today recognize his name. Nonetheless, many have heard of Nelson Rockefeller, who was Gerald Ford's vice president and long New York's governor, one of America's richest men. His full name, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, named for his grandfather, Nelson Aldrich. Aldrich's daughter married John D. Rockefeller Jr., and his son Winthrop became chairman of the Rockefeller's Chase National Bank. When Nelson Aldrich spoke on Capitol Hill, insiders knew he acted for the Rockefellers and their allies. The legislation Aldrich introduced, which became the Federal Reserve's basis, was crafted by several of America's richest bankers. At a secret 9-day meeting in 1910 on Jekyll Island off the Georgia coast. At that time, Jekyll Island was an exclusive retreat for the wealthy elite. In attendance were agents from the world's 3 greatest banking houses, those of John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and the Rothschilds. Acting for the Rockefellers were Senator Aldrich and Frank Vanderlip. Representing the Morgan interests were Benjamin Strong, head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company, Henry Davison, senior partner in J.P. Morgan and Company, and Charles Norton, head of Morgan's First National Bank of New York. The most important figure who ran the meeting was the Rothschild's agent, Paul Warburg. Paul Warburg belonged to a German banking family associated with the Rothschilds, the world's most powerful banking dynasty, who had grown rich by establishing central banks that loaned money to European countries. Its patriarch, Amschel Mayer Rothschild, said, "Permit me to issue and control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws." In 1901, Warburg immigrated to America intending to establish a similar central bank in the United States. He became a partner in Kuhn, Loeb & Company, the Rothschilds' banking satellite in New York City.
Who controls the Federal Reserve is pretty secretive, but for the most part we understand who controls it, and we know many of the families specifically involved. And it's what's known as the Eastern Establishment, many of the banking houses that have come to dominate the 20th century, and of course the robber barons who became monopolists of the major industries of the U.S.
The Rothschilds had long been allied with America's 2 foremost banking families, the Rockefellers and Morgans, providing the seed money for John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company and helping bail out J.P. Morgan when his firm was financially distressed. The axis of Warburg, Rothschild, Morgan, and Rockefeller and their Wall Street confederates became known as the Money Trust. President Wilson named Paul Warburg vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Benjamin Strong was appointed to run the New York Fed, the system's nucleus. The men who had secretly planned the bank now controlled it. At the time, Congress and the public had no inkling of the Jekyll Island meeting. Paul Warburg's annual salary at Kuhn Loeb had been $500,000, equal to well over $10 million in today's dollars. He relinquished that for a Federal Reserve position that paid $12,000. Warburg knew it would be far more profitable to control America's interest rates and make the stock market rise or fall at will. Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr., father of the famous aviator, helped lead the fight against the Federal Reserve Act. In 1913, he declared on the floor of the House,
"This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the President signed this act, the invisible government by the money power proven to exist by the money trust investigation will be legalized. The money power overhauls the legislative and executive forces of the nation. I have seen these forces exerted during the different stages of this bill. From now on, depressions will be scientifically created. The new law will create inflation whenever the trust wants inflation. If the trust can get a period of inflation, they figure they can unload stocks on the people at high prices during the excitement, and then bring on a panic and buy them back at low prices. The people may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed.
The day of reckoning, Lindbergh predicted, came with Black Thursday in the great crash of 1929. The crash wiped out millions of small investors, but not the money trust. Warburg, Rockefeller, Morgan, Bernard Baruch, and other top insiders had already exited the market. Although friendly biographers attribute their perfectly timed departure to their fiscal wisdom, fiscal foreknowledge of the Federal Reserve policy they controlled rigged the game in their favor. The Federal Reserve nearly doubled the discount rate between January and August of 1929. The bankers also pressured stocks down by heavily selling the market short and massively calling loans on investors who had borrowed to invest in stocks, forcing the borrowers to sell stock to repay the loans. These tactics converged, generating a snowballing panic that would bring the entire country into the greatest financial depression since the Civil War. Congressman Louis McFadden, chairman of the House Committee on Banking and Currency from 1920 to 1931, had this to say.
It was not accidental. It was a carefully contrived occurrence. The international bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair here, so that they might emerge as rulers of us all.
Afterwards, the money trust returned to the market, exactly as Congressman Lindbergh predicted. They bought up stocks that once sold for $10 per share at $1 per share, widening their ownership of corporate America.
Well, the Fed affects prices by devaluing the dollar. So every time you devalue the dollar by a little bit more, it costs that much more to purchase a good. When I talk to people who are struggling with the value of their money, and they talk about the need for a minimum wage to be higher, for instance, because they say, well, we've got to make more, we're not making a living wage. But they never seem to connect is the fact that part of the reason they don't make a living wage is because the value of what they're being paid continues to drop.
It's not what the young people are doing wrong, it's what's been done to them. When great-grandpa came here in 1900, there was no income tax back then. People today are spending about half their income on taxation. It's true when you take your federal income tax, state income tax, real estate tax, social security tax, sales tax, excise tax, utility tax. You're paying about half your income in taxation. Now, doesn't it make sense? If you pay half your income to taxes, you'll need 2 jobs to maintain the same standard of living that 1 job used to pay for.
So if you understand who these people are, and you understand what their mission is and how they think and what their ideology is, then most of the mysteries of the modern world, how come we're getting into this mess, or why are we doing this, and so on, they become easy to answer. If you don't understand that little twist of that word, read is not America. It's not for voters. Then all of these things remain a mystery.
Who's the guy that deregulated the Glass-Steagall Act, the banking act, that we put it together in 1933, following the crash of '29, because of what Wall Street and the banks did? Robert Rubin, under Clinton, Leo Seifert, Goldman Sachs. Who's the head of the European Central Bank? Mario Draghi. Where's he from? European Director of Goldman Sachs. Who's the fellow that's running the Bank of England? Mark Carney? Oh yeah, him. Where's he from? Goldman Sachs.
And it's the bankers, it's the heads of international corporations, it's the existing power structure. And people say, well, if we don't have government, we won't be protected from the evils of rich people. It's like, no, I'm sorry. When you have a government, what you have done is put an army of enforcers at their disposal.
The United States is run like a major corporation.
The 20th century in the United States has been one of centralization, as it has been around the world. It's partly due to the rise of technology, and it's partly due to the consolidation of these banking powers.
So who really runs America? the global money paradigm really runs America, but the people, if they have consensus, and I think we can give several examples, the global food revolution is certainly one example where you see people from Occupy Wall Street and people from the Tea Party, people from all different segments of society coming together to say we want clean food. And you notice that this is maybe one of our most successful endeavors. So I like to think the truth is that the people in consensus run America, but if we don't do it and we don't spend time doing that, then the global money paradigm runs America like they run everywhere else.
So it's killing everybody. It's costing everybody to live more, and everyone's earning less. The numbers don't lie. The numbers are there for everybody to look at. Median household income is below 1999 levels. Kids with college degrees, half of them have jobs that only require a high school education. They're robbing us right in front of our eyes. And you have slimeball politicians and prostitutes on these business shows that keep the lie going. Too big to fail.
What's going to kill the dollar is when people realize that it's a system of exploitation that funds oppression, that funds wars, that funds the police state, that funds all the regulations that are keeping you from being able to conduct your business the way that's going to make you happy, and they abandon it. That's what's going to kill the dollar.
Hey, the power's in our hands. Now that we know what the game is they're loaning our own money at interest and putting us in debt so far that this country will crash. Bad austerity will come to this country. This is right off the IMF's, World Bank's plans to go in and wreck countries. The chickens have come home to roost. But don't call for the end of the Fed unless you have a pretty clear idea, some kind of consensus of what we're going to have in its place.
The Federal Reserve itself does not have absolute autonomy to act as it wants within the global system. It acts according to the international body of the Bank for International Settlements. The Federal Reserve, by default, inherits some of that secrecy, if you will. And we'll never know what happens, what really goes on inside the Bank for International Settlements, much less the Fed.
What can be done about it? Well, not a whole lot unless Congress gets off their hands and does something about it.
The most significant mechanism for forcing the U.S. dollar on the American people and on the world as the world reserve currency is through requiring it for payments of taxation. And you can't pay your taxes even if you're engaging in barter. You're supposed to be reporting all of that. You're supposed to be paying your taxes in U.S. dollars. So there's an inherent demand for that. There are certain things you can only use dollars for, and therefore it becomes the dominant currency. And there are some things that you really can't avoid it for. You know, if you want to park on the street here, you know, you got to put coins in the meter. If you, are doing something in your life that exposes you to a tax liability, that means you've given the government an excuse to steal from you that is generally accepted by their enforcers. Yes, I understand there's no way around it, but there's a very simple way that you can opt out of the system by doing as much as your economic transactions as possible in non-dollar denominated currencies, either gold, silver, or what's really exciting now that's opening things up is cryptocurrency, Bitcoin being just the first of many.
In January 1919, 2 months after the armistice, the delegates of the victorious powers arrived in Paris for the peace conference to draw up the terms to be offered to the defeated countries. In all, the representatives of 27 nations attended that conference.
Who did Wilson appoint to head the American delegation to the peace conference? Paul Warburg, who had also named vice chairman of the Federal Reserve. How could Warburg, a recent immigrant, be the only person qualified for this critical position? Who did Wilson bring to Paris as chief economic advisor? Bernard Baruch, to whom he made all those campaign pledges. As always, the president was under the watchful eye of Edward Mandell House, the banker's frontman. Wilson did not invite any leading Democratic Party members to Paris. Not one senator or congressman accompanied him, only the bankers and their entourage. At this conference, Wilson presented his famous 14 points. The most important of them called for establishing the League of Nations. Many people think he invented the League, but it originated with House and the bankers. Ray Stannard Baker, Wilson's official biographer, said,
Practically nothing, not a single idea in the covenant of the League was original with the president.
Charles Seymour, House's official biographer, said, Wilson approved the House draft almost in its entirety, and his own rewriting of it was practically confined to phraseology. What were the bankers seeking in the League? World government. The Paris Conference produced the Versailles Treaty, which officially established the League of Nations. Ironically, though Wilson had proposed the League, the United States did not join. The U.S. Constitution stipulated no president could single-handedly make a treaty. The Senate had to ratify it. The Senate rejected the Versailles Treaty. Americans had helped win the war, but saw no reason to join an organization that might infringe on their sovereignty. When news of the Senate vote reached Paris, the bankers reacted swiftly. They held a series of meetings and resolved to form a new organization in the United States. Its purpose would be to change the American opinion so the nation would accept world government. In 1921, that organization was incorporated in New York City as the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council's original roster reveals that most members were bankers or lawyers affiliated with J.P. Morgan and Company. For example, Morgan's personal attorney, John W. Davis, was the CFR's founding president. Morgan's attorney, Paul Cravath, was founding vice president. Morgan's partner, Russell Leffingwell, was first chairman. Since this looked unsuitable for a foreign affairs association, the council diversified its roster by adding professors. However, these came from universities receiving large grants from the Morgan interests. Professors, carefully screened, could be relied on to attend council meetings, then return to the universities and preach the glories of global government. By the late 1920s, the Rockefellers had brought their people into the council. David Rockefeller was the CFR's chairman for many years and is still honorary chairman in 2014. One way the council influences government policy is through publications, including many books and especially its periodical Foreign Affairs, a virtual instruction manual for U.S. foreign policymakers. Time magazine has called it the most influential journal in print.
They do have a publication which my husband subscribes to. We've been reading it for a number of years because of the jaw-dropping insight that it provides into what they're thinking. And they don't mince words in there. They will come right out and say that we need to have this form of control, we need to do this form of manipulation, we need to convince people of these certain sets of beliefs. And you read this, and it's written in a very highfalutin, erudite, academic kind of a style. So you have to get past that to really get to the gist and the meat of what's being said.
The CFR's most important means of controlling policy is supplying cabinet-level and sub-cabinet-level personnel to the government. What policies have the council created? Let's take examples from after World War II. The League of Nations had effectively collapsed with the war's onset. Its successor was the United Nations, a bolder step toward world government. The UN began with a group of CFR members in the State Department. Working under Secretary of State Cordell Hull, they called themselves the Informal Agenda Group. The group drew up the original plan for the UN, then consulted 3 attorneys, all CFR members, who declared the scheme constitutional. Subsequently, they met with President Roosevelt, who approved the plan and publicly announced it the same day. After that, FDR made establishing the UN his top priority for post-war planning, just as the League of Nations had been to Wilson. At the UN's founding conference in San Francisco in 1945, most of the American delegates, 47, were CFR members.
The Korean War was designed to empower the UN. It had been the objection of some people that the UN could never actually enforce peace. And so, since the very first plank of the UN Charter says it's there to secure peace, this war was designed to validate the UN as peacekeeper. Even though 90% of the troops were American, it was said to be a UN action. And it was also a way of bypassing the Congress. We have never had a declaration of war since World War II. Once we got to the UN, that was it. Harry Truman sent troops to Korea without so much as consulting the Congress.
By instituting policies through, for example, the United Nations, they're able to say, here's something we want to happen to every single person on planet Earth. And I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, Desmond Tutu, Bishop Desmond Tutu, came out in support of a United Nations plan to number all the children. Their concern was that not all of the kids being born on planet Earth were making their way into a government database where they were being numbered and tracked. And so they came out with a program called PLAN that the phrase for this was, or their buzzword was, write me down, make me real.
America's post-war program of aid to Europe, the Marshall Plan, was allegedly the brainchild of General George Marshall, who proposed it in a Harvard commencement speech. In reality, it was not conceived by Marshall, but by a CFR study group with David Rockefeller as secretary. They originally intended President Truman to announce the proposal and call it the Truman Plan. However, after deliberating, they decided that Truman, a Democrat, might not win the support from congressional Republicans. Marshall, a CFR cohort, was chosen to reveal the plan because, as a military figure, he would be misperceived as politically neutral and win bipartisan support. The strategy worked.
The Marshall event is one of those things that people recognize from the history books, but you read a basic summary and you gloss over it. But it has huge importance for the building of the global system that happened in the wake of World War II, when essentially power was up for grabs, and in fact had been negotiated ahead of time.
The Marshall Plan was just another giant welfare plan. It weakened America financially, certainly designed more for control of these little nations that they were rebuilding, a lot more than it was to help them.
Americans were told that funds were for Europe's needy. They were not told, however, that the goods their tax dollars purchased came mostly from multinational corporations linked to the CFR. The Marshall Plan was even more sinister. Unknown to most Americans, Europeans paid for Marshall Plan goods with printing press money called counterpart funds. CFR member John J. McCloy, appointed High Commissioner to Germany, was in charge of this cash. He was approached by Jean Monnet, renowned as founder of the Common Market, predecessor of today's European Union. Time called him the father of Europe. In 1947, Monnet sent agents to McCloy, who put millions of dollars in counterpart funds at their disposal. This money jump-started the movement for European unity. It financed common market propaganda and a European Union youth movement, as well as schools that would promote European consolidation. The Council of Europe's first meeting in 1949, an election campaign favored candidates. Journalist Richard Rovere called McCloy chairman of the establishment, an insider's insider. When he returned to the U.S., he became chairman of both the Council on Foreign Relations and the Rockefellers' Chase Manhattan Bank. McCloy was also second president of the World Bank, which, like its sister, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, was started at the Bretton Woods Conference.
The Bretton Woods Agreement, where the IMF and World Bank were created, also created a reconstruction vehicle for Europe, which allowed the financial investments to flow to the central banks of choice and flow outward to what became American firms who got most of the business to rebuild Europe. It came with strings attached, and most of the European countries were under the yoke of U.S. command during the Reconstruction phase of what was known publicly as the Marshall Plan, but privately was concocted by the Wise Men, a group of very influential foreign policy people who are all members of the Council on Foreign Relations, and many of them also members of Skull and Bones. World War II was really about reshaping the world, giving birth to one version of the New World Order, which would be remade over and over again.
As with the Marshall Plan, the motive was never charity. After World War II, New York banks wanted to continue loaning money to government. However, what if war-torn nations had difficulty repaying? A fall guy was needed to guarantee the loans. Taxpayers. The World Bank and IMF gave carte blanche to the private banks, who could now make virtually any loan, however foolish, to foreign governments. If the government could not make an interest payment, the IMF or World Bank would bail them out with taxpayer money.
Billions of 1944, 45, 47 taxpayer dollars were poured into the construction of Europe. Untold sums of money that flowed through the central banks and out to the fascist partners of choice who would get the bids and the contracts to rebuild Europe, while the Council on Foreign Relations policy people helped to rebuild Europe along the lines that they wanted to see. Economic controls, wage controls, industrial agreements, and what became the footprints and baby steps and building blocks of the European Union that we see today.
Jesse Helms, former chairman of the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee, said,
"The New York banks have found important profit centers in lending to countries plunged into debt. This has been an essentially riskless game for the banks because the IMF and the World Bank have stood ready to bail the banks out with our taxpayers' money."
Furthermore, the World Bank and IMF often attach conditions to these loans. They may demand a voice in government policy. For example, they might dictate that a country privatize industries to multinational corporations before money comes through. The World Bank and IMF are instruments of profit and control.
And the U.S. foreign policy based in Washington enabled it all the way and put the key people in position to outright rule Europe until it was rebuilt along the designs of not God, not man, not national governments, but the emerging world government based in Council on Foreign Relations and their money powers.
I look at the World Bank and the IMF more or less as the next stage of the evolution of international banking.
The Bank for International Settlements, along with the World Bank and along with the IMF, have long been viewed as the engine of globalization. These have been the trike, if you will, that have impressed policies on countries all over the world to toe the globalist line.
We're told that this is necessary in order to regulate trade or in order to pacify nations that would be making war against us. But in fact, what this is about is creating debt.
People talk about the one world government or globalists as if we're just going to create one nation that all has the same name. But I don't think that's even necessary. We have banking systems that control the trade, they control what people do for a living. There are people who are living in African nations right now growing cotton in those nations. And those farmers are required to grow cotton because it's part of the debt payback when it goes to these huge globalist banks who have made loans to the country. And they can't compete with other countries around the world. The farmers want to grow something else because their margins are so small, and they're not allowed to simply because of the debt that is owed by their nation.
Mom's are difficult. Could the war have been won? Well, you probably know some Vietnam veterans. A lot of them were harmed during the war. There's issues with things like Agent Orange. A lot of them are sour because there's just a lingering confusion about what really happened during that war.
Every war is won by the people who profit from it. There's always been the case because war is a racket. As Major General Smedley Butler said, always has been, always will be. More men dying in original wars. The Vietnam War was won by those who made billions from it.
Every war we've had, at least since World War II, there was not a clear objective as to what we were doing as a nation in going there. What was the objective in Vietnam? I'm not sure most people even still know it.
You can't win a war unless you know what winning it means. We tend to think that the purpose of the Vietnam War was to fight the Viet Cong, to fight the communists. It wasn't. If that was the purpose of the war, we could have won quite easily. But the real purpose of war was much more complex than that.
Since World War II, it's very clear that every conflict we've been involved in doesn't make sense in terms of a clear objective of how to win, or why we win in the first place, what we're hoping to accomplish, other than if you were to say our goal is empire building. Now, if we had wanted to conquer the Vietnamese and ultimately occupy their nation, at least that's an objective that has a clear end game to it. We didn't seem to want to do that. So what were we actually doing?
The reasons behind it seem very confusing unless you know about the banker issue, unless you understand how the engine of America has been hijacked by the banking powers and its nebulous, ill-advised policies directed by the Council on Foreign Relations.
Perhaps no 20th century event impacted America more than the Vietnam War. The war, which lasted 14 years and ended in defeat, was called unwinnable by the establishment media, who blamed the U.S. military, claiming they had underestimated the communist forces under Ho Chi Minh.
That war was part of the proxy wars that happened all around the globe in the name of fighting communism. But it was also a means of reconstructing the Asian Pacific sphere of influence to make it safe for globalism. Again, the whole world had to be made over and brought up to standards for globalism. China being such a major power, Japan more or less under the yoke of the post-World War II agreements, and Vietnam down there in the triangle had to be basically reformed. That was the real reasons for the war. What we were told as Americans was not that we were fighting for our freedoms, not that we were stopping an evil that would take over the whole planet, but that we had been attacked on a ship, the Gulf of Tonkin, an incident that we now know clearly in history didn't happen the way we were told at all.
The media's memory was short. After World War II, U.S. foreign policy dictated that France leave Vietnam. The United States initially supported Ho Chi Minh. In 1945, the OSS, forerunner of the CIA, trained Ho's army and provided him with guns and 20,000 cartridges, which he used to fight the French. The U.S. press glorified him. In 1946, Newsweek compared him to George Washington. In 1954, with its troops hemmed in by Ho's forces at the critical battle of Dien Bien Phu, France begged the United States to intervene. An aircraft carrier strike would have averted disaster, but the U.S. government refused. Following the French pullout and the division of Vietnam into the North and South, U.S. foreign policy's next objective was removing Emperor Bao Dai, the one man capable of uniting the country. Bao Dai exclaimed,
"If your country had given me 1,000 of the sum they spent to depose me, I could have won that war."
Through a rigged plebiscite, Ngo Dinh Diem, the CFR's choice, was installed as South Vietnam's president. The South Vietnamese hated the oppressive Diem, who drove many into the communist arms. In the meantime, CIA Colonel Edward Lansdale, CFR member, oversaw the disarming of three powerful anti-communist groups in Vietnam: the Cao Dai sect, Hoa Hao sect, and Li Van Bien's private army. Having sponsored Ho Chi Minh and destroying French, imperial, and local opponents at every level, our CFR policymakers now launched the tragic conflict. World War II. The USA fights on two fronts, Europe and the Pacific. The Germans and Japanese were tough and well-equipped, yet we crushed both military empires with our allies' help in just 3.5 years. On the other hand, we spent 14 years fighting Little North Vietnam and lost. Something is terribly wrong with this picture. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara forbid the Air Force to strike over 90% of the strategic targets it wanted to hit. As a CFR member, he left the Defense Department to become president of the World Bank. Then, there were the rules of engagement, not declassified until 1985, when they consumed 26 pages of the Congressional Record's fine print. According to the rules, American soldiers were not allowed to shoot first, but had to wait until fired upon. If a pilot saw a MiG on the ground, he could not attack. He had to wait until it was airborne and showing hostile intent. If a surface-to-air missile launch site was under construction, he couldn't bomb it. He had to wait until it was operational. If we had fought World War II under such restrictions, we would have lost.
To me, at least, it's clear that the purpose of the war was not to defeat communism in Vietnam, because they could have done that quite easily, but as everyone knows by now, they deliberately put handcuffs on our military, made sure you don't go too far into enemy territory, you don't counterattack, you don't bomb the supply lines, you use powder puff war all the way along. We call it powder puff war because it wasn't aimed at victory. That's probably not doing it justice because there were so many lives tragically lost. Bloody war. It was not fought to win.
In 1968, journalist Lloyd Milland interviewed nearly a dozen retired high-ranking U.S. military officers. Each, queried separately, said the war would be won in weeks or months with the restraints lifted. This would allow the war to be carried out aggressively against the North. The media claimed the war was initiated by right-wing anti-communists or hawks. The first U.S. combat troops went to Vietnam in 1961. President Kennedy authorized sending about 10,000 men on the advice of the State Department's Walt Rostow, who had just returned from a fact-finding mission to Vietnam. Although the press portrayed Rostow as a hawk, his father had been a Marxist revolutionary in Russia. Two of his aunts belonged to the U.S. Communist Party. His brother, Eugene Debs Rostow, was named after Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs, and the Eisenhower State Department rejected Walt for employment 3 times as a security risk. The Kennedy administration could only get him in by firing Otto Patefka, the State Department's head of security. In a book published a year before his advice to Kennedy, Rostow wrote,
"It is a legitimate American national objective to see removed from all nations, including the United States, the right to use substantial military force to pursue their own interests. Since this right is the root of national sovereignty, it is therefore an American interest to see an end to nationhood, as it has been historically defined."
This statement summarized the outlook of the Council on Foreign Relations, to which Rostow belonged.
Johnson had to give some very awkward and rather embarrassing speeches convincing America why Vietnam, why he was sending their sons, their brothers, their fathers off to war.
As earlier noted, Congress authorized President Johnson to intervene in Vietnam through the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, written before the 2 alleged attacks on the U.S. Navy in the Tonkin Gulf. Admiral Stockdale testified that the second attack never happened. The premature resolution was written by William P. Bundy, Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs and member of the CFR. Like Rostow, Bundy was portrayed as a hawk. Yet, in the 1950s, Bundy headed the defense fund for Soviet spy Alger Hiss. After Bundy left the State Department, David Rockefeller appointed him editor of Foreign Affairs, journal of the CFR, and America's leading opponent of national sovereignty. In 1964, President Johnson successfully ran for re-election against Republican Barry Goldwater, whom the press branded a warmonger. After the election, Johnson himself suddenly began escalating the war, committing hundreds of thousands of troops. He made the decision at the urging of a secret clique called the Wise Men, 14 senior advisors, 12 of whom were CFR members.
The Wise Men included a number of important Council on Foreign Relations members, 6 key members actually, Averell Harriman, Robert Lovett, and John J. McCloy, all 3 of them Bonesmen, and all 3 of them very closely tied to the banking powers of New York City and to the Rockefeller family. John J. McCloy's resume reads like a true globalist. He was a Skull and Bones member. He was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was in the staff as an Undersecretary of State during World War II, and he would later go on to head the Rockefeller Foundation. He was the president of the Council on Foreign Relations for a solid decade, and he was head of the World Bank.
The leader of the Wise Men, who led the demand for escalation, Dean Acheson. Even before the United States recognized the USSR in 1933, the murderous dictator Joseph Stalin selected young attorney Acheson to represent Soviet interests in America. Truman's Secretary of State, Acheson, surrounded himself with communist and security risks.